The last time we have found and explored an abandoned Balaur laboratory. There we gained a lot of knowledge about the Balaur, Tiamat, and Seal's relic. The goal was to bring Seal's relic to life, so they can control the power of time freely by controlling the vessel. While this did succeed and Dark Spider was opened, weird time anomalies or time warps have appeared all over the lab, and since they couldn't control those, they closed the lab and transported Seal's relic to another place. All of this only strengthens our resolve to finding and securing Seal's relic as quickly as possible, because as long as Tiamat has Seal's relic by her side, situations like with Dark Poeta could happen at any point, and maybe even worse things. Finally back in Inggison, we are already called to Julia for our next mission. The petrification from the Scar Canyon somehow spreads further and further. To prevent Tiamat's curse from advancing, Julia has called a gifted scholar named Sula. And Sula has reported that the nearby hill is not actually a simple hill, but a fragment of something else. Julia has to send someone there to examine it and help Sula with his information gathering there. And since she saw our mission reports from the Theobomos lab, she thought it would be a good idea to send us. Now before we go into the mission, there is an interesting thought about Julia calling the petrification Tiamat's curse. Because back in Vertron at the beginning of our journey, we learned about the Sumian temple and Meslam Teda, who also, without much effort, turned not only all the humans in the temple, but also the entire temple itself into stone, and sank the entire temple underwater. So is this a thing the Balau Lords are simply capable of? I mean, petrification is a skill that some Balaur enemies do use to stun you for a while, but as many others I also have not really given it much deeper thought, simply explaining it as a gameplay feature that, you know, stun, petrification, it kind of fits and that's why it is called that. But no, with this, the petrification skill of the Balaur actually has lore relevancy, which is a cool detail in my opinion. However, let's get back to our mission now. Sula explains that the petrification is an accumulation of fragments, and these fragments may be of organic origin, meaning it basically lives. He has a theory, but we shall help his colleague Phelon first, before he elaborates any further. Phelon was sent to examine samples in the Scar Canyon, but he hasn't returned yet. At his campsite, Phelon explains that he doesn't manage to get a sample of the petrified hill, and even explains it like this. It's almost as though the hill is alive and refusing to let go of a limb. Yeah, maybe you should take a look at the hill instead of in the book, Phelon. However, he sends us to gather these samples now, and then we shall take them straight to Sula. Back at Sula, he examines the samples, and who could have guessed that the hill is indeed a Petralith remnant? Really mind-blowing stuff. I mean, come on. We are supposed to be a hero, and those are scholars and archaeologists, and nobody ever took a look at the hill from a bit further away? Are you serious? But back to the topic now. This confirms that Petraliths also were here in Inggison. But since we Elyos haven't been here for a long time, we are sent to a Rayan named Titus. The Rayan have been living here much longer than we have, and they adapted to Balauria much better than we Elyos did. So maybe they can tell us more about it. As we greet Titus, the conversation goes in a different direction at first, because he tells us to be careful that the Dragonbound don't kidnap us while we are here. He just escaped himself. They brought him to the Udas temple and tried to brainwash him. But we simply redirect the conversation to be about the Petraliths and ask him what he can tell us about them. He didn't even know that we called them Petraliths. Back when Tiamat fled Inggison, They called them Aeon soldiers because they protected them from the Balaur. They held unbelievable power and could make the earth shake just by moving their bodies. He still remembers their shouts as they went up against the Balaur. But back then they didn't know that those were the last soldiers of the Lord. Well, at least until he saw one of them in the Udas temple. And here we go back again to when the Dragonbound dragged Titus into the Udas temple. They entered the room and suddenly all of them cried out, "Stormwing, Stormwing!" And all threw their hands into the air. It must have been some kind of ritual. The Dragonbound were so engrossed in what they were doing that Titus managed to escape. But the temple was like a labyrinth, and he spent ages just wandering around. Here he says, "At some point I stumbled upon a room that looked like a library. But when I stepped into the room, I suddenly caught sight of unfamiliar creatures walking among the ranks of Aeon soldiers."
I was so preoccupied back then, I don't remember how I got in.
I think the door opened when I pulled the bloody great hammer from a Drakan statue. Maybe it was a key.
If you're up for it, maybe you can head to Underborg and look for it yourself.
Shora Steadfast took it. Maybe that's where you'll find it.
He doesn't remember how exactly he got in or out of there, but he does remember taking a bloody hammer from a Drakan stone statue. He also remembers that in the room was some bag laying in the corner. It looked like it hasn't been laying there for long. Maybe that's something worth to check out. So we searched for the hammer and found it on one of the Dragonbound's corpses. We took the hammer to the Drakan statue and laid it into the Drakan's hands. We found ourselves in a hidden library Titus mentioned. There are many traps all over this room, and one giant creature guarding it. We activate a switch that destroyed all the traps, and only the giant creature is left. After we killed the creature, we found the bag, and inside of it was a book. The book is a diary from an individual that took over when the landlord Theobomos disappeared. He's trying to find an energy source to resurrect Project Drakanhammer. On his search for an energy source, he discovered the Dragonbound. They were digging in a cave, and as he was curious, he decided to knock one of them out and steal their clothes. Now disguised as a Dragonbound, he did go into the cave and discovered that the Dragonbound also tried to find parts of Project Drakanhammer. But they had no energy source either. A few diary entries later, he writes that Theo, meaning the landlord Theobomos, was right. It exists, and that he must get it, no matter the cost. And the last diary entry ends with one single word. Oops. We do not know who the diary belongs to right now, but we know that not only the owner of the diary is trying to resurrect the Project Drakanhammer, also the Dragonbound here are trying to gather pieces of it. Hopefully we will find out more soon. But for now, let's go to Julia and bring her the journal.